After using my Sony cameras with the RS2 and the RavenEye, I've run into a few different issues that took me longer than I care to admit to figure out. I've been writing down all of my issues with the RS2, RavenEye, and Sony cameras for the past few months, and also gathering your feedback as well. This is going to be a very dense video, but be sure to watch the entire thing because there are a lot of little small details that carry over from camera to camera. Some of these are limitations of the cameras, and others are not as obvious, like not plugging in everything and starting it up in the right sequence can cause some errors, even if everything is configured correctly. I've waited a while to see if these problems will be addressed with firmware updates, and if any of those happen in the future, I'll let you know in the pinned comment down below. Starting off with some general troubleshooting techniques, one is to make sure that the camera, RS2, and the RavenEye are all on the latest firmware. This can cause errors and glitches that don't give you error messages, and even if there are error messages, they're not that helpful. Since there are so many different parts, I found the sequence also matters when you set this up and turn it on. I found the most luck connecting the cables to everything and then starting the RS2, followed by the camera, and then the RavenEye last. Then connect your RavenEye Wi-Fi to your device, and then open up the Ronin app. This has given me the best odds for everything working correctly, and it will give you some weird errors if you start plugging these things in out of sequence, and like I said, it might not even be an error at all. If something seems like it should be working, or you've had it working before and it's just not working now, try turning everything off and then turning it back on again. Typically, it will sort those kind of issues out. And make sure your battery is fully charged on your RavenEye if you haven't used it in a while. Let's start off with some common problems with the A7 III and the RS2 and the RavenEye. The most common problem here is that people want to use their RS2, their RavenEye, and a USB-C camera control cable at the same time. The USB-C cable allows you to adjust your camera settings and start and stop recording through the Ronin app. Well, technically it can do that, but there is a major downside, that your camera's feed is completely blacked out on the A7 III. I've tested this with 4K and 1080p with different USB settings, and the rear screen is always blacked out when plugging the USB-C cable from the RavenEye into your A7 III. You will still be able to adjust your settings and start and stop recording, but the whole point of using the RavenEye is to be able to see your camera's feed while you're doing this. You can't use ActiveTrack either, and I just wouldn't recommend using the USB-C cable with the A7 III at all. It's really annoying that the second you plug the USB-C cable into your A7 III, you will not be able to get a feed. This is a limitation of the A7 III, and it's not a fault of the RS2 or the RavenEye. The RavenEye can't display or use ActiveTrack if the A7 III isn't sending that information to the screen. The multi-cable on the A7 III functions as it should, but it gives you less functionality. You're able to start and stop recording, and the feed stays live on the Ronin app, but the back of the camera is blacked out if you're filming in 4K. Even though the back of the camera is blacked out, ActiveTrack still works though, since the RavenEye is going and sending that signal to the Ronin app. The camera stays on while recording in 1080p at all frame rates though. Again, this is a limitation of the A7 III as the rear screen turns off while you're filming in 4K with any HDMI out of this camera. This next one is one of the most ridiculous setups yet, but after it was mentioned in one of my YouTube comments, I had to try it out. After making a previous video about adding a monitor to the RS2 and the RavenEye, a guy mentioned he wanted to see if he can get ActiveTrack and Face Detect Autofocus in 4K to work on the A7 III with his Atomos Ninja 5 while also transmitting the signal from his RavenEye to the Ronin app. To get Face Detect to work in 4K with HDMI out, we'll have to disable internal recording on the A7 III by going to the menu, set up page 4 of 7, and select 4K output to HDMI only. You can do 24 or 30p here. We've just disabled internal recording on the A7 III, and now we're only able to record externally to our Ninja 5. Shout out to 2018 Gerald Undone. To ensure Face Detect is enabled, go to your menu, Camera 1, page 6 of 14, and Face Eye AF settings. Set your Face Eye priority in AF to on, and make sure the subject detection is human, unless you'll be shooting photos of your dog. Otherwise, choose animal. To take this a step further with our RS2 and Ronin app, we can use our multi-cable to tell our camera when to start and stop recording, and this will also work with the record button on the back of the RS2 and the record button on the Ronin app. However, our camera will actually be telling our Ninja 5 to start and stop recording since we just disabled internal recording. This is pretty cool, and we can enable this by jumping back into the A7 III's menu and go to Setup, page 3, HDMI settings, enable TC output, and enable record control. And now this whole setup will work with our face detect in 4K recording to our Ninja 5, and we're transmitting that ActiveTrack to our Ronin app, and we can select a target like a person's face, and it will track them, and it will also have face detection autofocus on. This is pretty cool. Obviously a ridiculous setup, but if you need this functionality and you have all this tech already, you can assemble it so it'll work for you. And now moving on from our A7 III to our A6400, the A6400 is able to use the Sony multi-cable, and like the other cameras, plugging this into the A6400 and then into the top slot on our USB-C slots on our RS2 will allow us to use the features without needing to adjust any menu settings. Interestingly though, while you're using the RavenEye and the Sony multi-cable, the rear screen on the back will turn off while you're filming in 4K, but it will be on when you're filming in 1080p. The rear screen will be off whether you're recording or not. The Ronin screen will display the feed, but the rear screen will be turned off. I found with most cables, you'll want to rig all the cables onto the camera and the RS2 while it's off, then turn on the gimbal and then the camera last. While sometimes plugging into the cables to the gimbal while they're powered on, sometimes they just won't recognize the cables, and that was especially true with the A6400. The Sony micro cable is one that I haven't had much luck with though. After plugging it into the RS2 and the A6400, my RavenEye just feed wouldn't work, and regardless if I was recording or not, the camera was completely unresponsive and all the screens were blacked out. The compatibility chart says you can adjust your camera settings with this, but based on my experience, I wouldn't recommend using this cable at all. Very strange that I wasn't able to get this one working. I spent a lot of time trying to adjust menu settings and using different ports on the RavenEye and the RS2, but it just seemed like nothing would work. So I would stick to the Sony multi-cable if you're using the Sony A6400. Moving on to the A7 III, we can use the USB-C cable or the Sony multi-cable. The USB-C cable was by far the most requested one on my YouTube comments to use with the A7S III, so let's start with that one. To get the USB-C cable working correctly, we'll have to plug the USB-C cable into the RSS feed of our RavenEye to be able to start and stop and adjust our camera settings in the Ronin app. Don't plug the camera into the top slot of the RS2 in the front of the gimbal because I don't know why, but I just couldn't get this USB-C cable to work correctly while using it plugged directly into the RS2. You have to plug it into the RavenEye. We'll have to enable the PC remote function, or attaching a USB-C cable to our camera will take it into USB mode, which we don't want. To turn USB connection to PC remote, in the menu, go to the Network tab. Under option 1 of Transfer Remote, select PC Remote Function, and then PC Remote On. And make sure the PC Remote connection method is set to USB. Also, while we're in this menu, make sure Control with Smartphone is off as well. If you're having issues with the back of your camera being blacked out while you're filming with the RavenEye or any HDMI out, make sure to turn off HDMI info display. This will output a clean signal to your recorder and enable the rear screen of your A7S III to show your feed and your camera settings. To turn this on, go to Setup, 11 External Output, HDMI info display, and turn this off. Keep in mind that we're using the RavenEye's RSS USB-C port, so we won't be able to start or stop recording on the back of the gimbal. We'll have to do this from the Ronin app. I haven't been able to get the USB-C cable plugged directly into the RS2 to work, so I just wouldn't recommend using it unless you have the RavenEye and plan on using your phone and need to adjust your shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. Which brings us to our next more sensible cable, you guessed it, the Sony multi-cable. The Sony multi-cable is by far the easiest way to have that simple start-stop functionality with the RS2. Plugging the cable into the camera and then into the top slot of the RS2 will get you that simple start-stop recording that you'd expect on the Ronin app and the back of the RS2. After that long experience of adjusting settings on the back of the camera and messing with the USB-C cable, I prefer to use the Sony multi-cable and just adjust the settings I have to on the back of my camera. It isn't as convenient as using a touchscreen for quick adjustments, but the setup alone deters me away from using the USB-C cable. If you're finding this information useful, subscribe to help find your way back in the future. It really does help my channel out, and less than 4% of my viewers are actually subscribed. And your subs, likes, and feedback really do go a far way for my channel. If you're a new subscriber, welcome to the channel, and if you're a returning subscriber, welcome back. After testing all of these Sony cameras and having issues with all the cables that allow you to adjust your camera settings, you either have to go into the settings of your camera, or sometimes they just might not even give you a video feed. So I find myself using the send to smartphone option a lot. And while I was researching this video, I was enabling and disabling that while I was testing, and it just got annoying. So I found myself just manually adjusting my settings on the back of the camera and just using the Sony multi-cable for the start-stop functionality, which is honestly the one that I use the most while I'm using this gimbal. So the conclusion for which camera control cable is the best, I'm going to say the Sony multi-cable. It allows you to start and stop recording, but that's all I need most of the time anyways. Some of the camera settings I want to adjust anyway go beyond shutter, ISO, and aperture anyways, so even if I had the USB-C cable working, I still found myself digging into the settings on my menus anyways. For the USB-C cable, it's really not worth the additional setup, and I just like that simple start and stop recording functionality that the Sony multi-cable gives me without any of the headache of the USB-C cable. Another problem some people are having, myself included, is where the RavenEye doesn't seem to be active tracking your subjects very well. If you use ActiveTrack on DJI drones, you'll often have the ActiveTrack detect if it's a person, car, or boat. But the RS2 ActiveTrack isn't that sophisticated to determine what the subject is. And I find that if you're tracking a person's face and suddenly another person enters the frame, the RS2 ActiveTrack isn't capable of staying on the selected person's face. And when it realizes that it's not the right target, it'll jump back and try to catch the original person that it was supposed to be tracking. I think the RS2 and RavenEye ActiveTrack works more off of patterns, and it does best in high contrast scenarios where there's good separation from the subject to the background. Also, make sure your gimbal balance is good and recalibrate if you swap lenses or add cables even. One last thing, make sure your follow speeds are low while you're using ActiveTrack. If they are too aggressive, the RS2 will sometimes overcorrect for a subject and then have to overcorrect the other way to compensate for that incorrect movement. This is a vicious cycle, and if this happens, I just double tap the trigger to recenter the gimbal and instantly stop any weird motions the RS2 is having. This is more likely to happen if your subject is filling the frame in too close. Like I stated in my RavenEye and monitor setup video, I wouldn't recommend active tracking a subject and just putting this gimbal down and relying on it as a camera operator. It's good if you understand its limitations and are using it actively, but it's not good enough to be an autonomous camera operator yet. Hopefully their next version will have that object recognition that their drones have and be able to stay on target a little better, even if there are multiple people in the frame. The more I use this setup, surprisingly though, I've been using the RS2 and RavenEye with the Sony multi-cable and not using my phone as a screen, but using the RS2 to initiate ActiveTrack using the screen on the back. If I'm using my A7 III and filming in 4K, I'll have to use my phone as a monitor to see what I'm doing since the Ronin app is the only screen and the back of the camera would be blacked out. But if I'm filming in 1080p, I do not need to use my phone as I can see the back screen of my camera though. The only thing over time I've been using my phone with is if I need a really fine-tune my ActiveTrack targeting. But that being said, I have been getting kind of good at just picking out the ActiveTrack target on this little screen and just using that to initiate my ActiveTrack points. But it does take some getting used to from going from a nice big phone screen to the tiny screen on the back of the RS2. To learn how to use the RS2 ActiveTrack without the Ronin app, check out my RS2 tips and tricks video. Using the multi-cable allows me to start and stop recording, and so far that has worked great for me. The only time I use the USB-C cable is with my A7S III, since I can utilize all that functionality with the Ronin app while getting a live feed from my camera in 4K while recording. That being said, I don't find myself using the Ronin app to adjust my camera settings as much as I thought I would. I don't film in situations where I need to dynamically change my camera settings, so it's really more convenient for me to just use a simpler cable and adjust my settings on the camera. This isn't a huge deal for me, but I thought I'd bring it up because some people in the comments of my other videos have been really upset by this. It's not a deal breaker for me, but it is something to be aware of. This was by far one of my most researched videos, and if something changes, I will update the pinned comment below. I realize this video is really specific and it probably won't reach a super wide audience, but hopefully people with these problems find this video helpful, and if you did, consider subscribing and checking out some of my other RS2 videos. That really does help my channel a lot, and I just want to thank you guys for sticking around to the end, and I'll see you in the next one.